Good afternoon. I'm Raleigh Flynn. I'm the president of the Foreign Policy Research Institute, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to today's program, The Fight Against Digital Disinformation, which will feature FPRI's distinguished research fellow, Clint Watts, to talk about the struggle that the U.S. is currently engaged in a global information war. Clint Watts is no stranger to many of you. He's not only FPRI's distinguished research fellow, he also developed our FIE 2020 project, that's foreign interference in the election 2020, a project that he worked on all this last year, which just concluded. He is a former U.S. Army infantry officer and former FBI special agent and former executive officer at the Combating Terrorism Center at West Point. He is a major contributor to FPRI and someone we always look forward to having on these events. Before I let you go, I'd also like to put in a plug for an upcoming event on Wednesday, May 26th from 3 to 4 p.m. We're going to be talking about Beyond Britain, Brexit's impact on the US, Northern Ireland, and the international community. And that will feature it will be our installment of this month's mainline briefing featuring John Noggle, who will be the moderator, and he'll be joined by FPRI's Connor Donan and Ron Ranieri. And finally, before I turn it back over to Clint Watts, I would like to say thank you to our members and our donors. And if you're not yet in that category, encourage you to get into that category because we do need your support to make these events happen. Put your questions in the Q&A box and Clint will be drawing on those. And so without further ado, take it away, Clint. Thank you.
Thanks for having me, Raleigh, and thanks to everybody for all the support. It's been, I just realized today when I was checking in, it's been a decade now that I've been with FPRI, a little more than a decade. And so it's been an amazing decade for all sorts of research that I've been working on. I really appreciate FPRI's support. A decade ago, that would have been 2011. About this time, Osama bin Laden had died. It's interesting how we are back. We hardly talk about terrorism at this point. And even 5 years ago, I might have been doing a presentation on Al-Qaeda or the Islamic State. But now we're really talking about great power competition. But the one constant that remains is information warfare. So I came to this space, and I'm just going to show a few slides today, just in terms of structure to try and put some context around it. And if folks have questions, please throw them in the Q&A section, and I will make sure and address them, as we go or at the very end. But if we rewound to 2005, when I started at the Combating Terrorism Center at West Point, what would be fascinating is we were really talking about the start of information warfare. And what was fascinating to me at that time was we were talking about strategic communications. How would we communicate against Al-Qaeda or ISIS? How would we discuss those issues of democracy and championing the United States around the world so we could win back the support of allies and partners in their populations as we were trying to fight off the threat of jihadist ideology. Interestingly enough, we're not focused too much on jihadist ideology anymore, yet we're in the same fight. We're still trying to figure out how to communicate strategically around the world. And in the meantime, over the last 16 years, what we've seen is a major transition, whereas from the analog era and into the digital era, in 2005, we were starting to talk about Al-Qaeda's use of the internet, their movement to social media platforms that were just kind of moving to this new platform called YouTube at the time, taking videos and showing videos of themselves or their attacks on American soldiers around the world. And so now when we watch what's going on, we're facing an exponential growth in terms of information and communication in the digital environment. I was recently doing a presentation and talking about how do we get around this. And I had the opportunity to talk to some of the new folks that are taking roles inside government, and how do we handle this era? And part of it is we still remain structured as if it's 1955 rather than 2021. We're almost at the beginning of the Cold War in terms of our structures, in terms of how we're trying to handle things, as if it's the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. We have a Cold War structure for how our government handles information, how it communicates information, and that's just not going to work anymore. Meanwhile, our adversaries have innovated, despite being the ones who are kind of at the whim of the internet in the beginning, very fearful of it. Russia, China, lots of authoritarian regimes were in the first decade of the internet petrified and overwhelmed by it. There was so much information that was coming into their audiences that had never been present before, but they were incentivized. They knew that it was a direct threat to their existence. They knew that they had to take over essentially those information environments. And so many of you might have remembered, if you attended a presentation I did about the book Messing with the Enemy when I had it come out a couple of years ago, was that they found that the only thing more damaging to society was, instead of no information, was too much information. Essentially, that if you can flood the information space with so much content that it becomes difficult for audiences to know or understand what they are consuming, it becomes very challenging for them. So if you have that digital opportunity, they've now done several things. One, they've overwhelmed the information space, but they've also infiltrated the information space in such a way that they can sully it, they can corrode it, they can distort people's perceptions of reality. And all of this distortion creates essentially a problem for democracies, because if we can't agree on fact and fiction, or we're not sure what the reality is of any given situation at home or abroad, it becomes very, very difficult for us to maneuver and really push our message, our American message, out against the world. So with that, one way I wanted to address this is I hear, at least in my discussions, when we're talking about modern warfare, and particularly information warfare or cyber, that it is a distorted view. We still in the US are putting a geographic lens over information war vis-a-vis our adversaries. By that, I mean, we will talk or sort of connote that it's Russia and China, or the US versus Russia and China, or that Russia is using a specific playbook and the Chinese are following it. And all of these things are a little bit distorted. They're not quite accurate, because there are no geographic boundaries in the virtual world. There are two assumptions that critically undermine what the US does right now. One, the idea that there's a difference between foreign and domestic in terms of the information space. There is no such thing. It's just the information space. And second, that there is some sort of hard split between what happens in the real world and what happens in the virtual world. This also does not exist. What happens in one powers the other, or vice versa. For example, when the Islamic State invaded Iraq and triggered our actions to go back into Iraq in the 2013, 14, 15 time period, that was a physical action that powered what they were doing in the online space, which would create more real world recruits that went into Iraq. Same in the case of Russia with the election in 2016. They were creating the impression that things were occurring in the United States, which caused people to go to the streets and even show up at protests for and against the same issue. For example, in Texas, they mobilized a pro and anti-Islam protest from Russia, but they did it in Texas. So they had both parties on opposing sides of the street. They also did this in Florida, where they created a rally in front of a cheesecake factory, and there were no Russians attending that. They did that remotely. So this idea, there are two distinctions that don't make any sense to me. One, physical, virtual, they all overlap and are tied to each other now. And the other is foreign and domestic. And we've seen this in our own internal politics. So if we are trying to attack this problem, and now we have many adversaries on this battlefield, and I'll show you a sample of our big three authoritarian adversaries, we're really talking about four battlefields today. The one that we were focused on, headed into the election, and the FIE project we did here at FBRI, was inside the United States, which is essentially what were foreign adversaries doing in our language, predominantly English, but also in Spanish, and on our social media platforms and in our media space. Separate from that, is the tangential battlefield, which is our allies and partners. Essentially, what are allies and partners seeing vis-a-vis each of these? And that would be particularly vis-a-vis Russia, that would be Europe and the European Union. So many different countries, many different languages, mostly Western platforms. In Asia and the Pacific, that would be Australia, Japan, Korea, that would be our allies and partners and their languages, but still a mix of our platforms. The real vector by which they advance, whether it's any authoritarian at this point, is through their diaspora population. So for Russia, they use their Russian speaking population and a mix of Russian applications to connect with their audiences. And for the Chinese in particular, they're using a mix of Western and Chinese applications in Chinese language. And that's a battle space, which is the adversary diaspora. Then the last one is inside our adversaries. So when we're talking about going toe to toe with Russia, Iran, or China, or any other country as an adversary, we're really talking about being in their language, in their platforms. And this is where China has a distinct advantage over the United States and a distinct advantage over Russia in the sense that they control and own their own information space. They have technological surveillance, they have censorship capability, they're a next level manipulator. Whereas the Russians would like to be able to do that, but they cannot replace the internet in the way that the Chinese can. And so this is a distinct challenge for the US. So if we're planning an information war, it's not about Europe, Asia, these physical locations, it's about these four audience spaces and what we can do about them. So the next thing I wanted to talk briefly about is watching the strengths and weaknesses. And I think a few things illustrate themselves over time. In terms of strengths, the Russians, in terms of both volume and reach, are superior to all of the other authoritarian regimes. But they also have weaknesses too, their control and their resources. They are limited in terms of how much they can control their message down the road. And they're also resource limited in that they have to use proxies like oligarchs. They are doing amazingly well right now. I should have put the Middle East, Africa, and Latin America. The Kremlin, while we tend to pose it as us, Europe, Russia, they're doing really, really well in other places, and they're taking advantage of these opportunities. One such opportunity is RT in Arabic is the most watched cable news channel right now in the Middle East. So that's a powerful tool that's at their disposal. A weakness is a lot of this is controlled by oligarchs, meaning the Russian state doesn't control it outright. They have to essentially push out a degree of control in order to advance this around the world. And by doing that, they have some sort of a weakness in there. Iran, by the way, was the most aggressive in the election. They didn't change any votes, but they created a lot of chaos and turbulence. You might have heard about a fake Proud Boys text message that was going out trying to incite people and stoke fear. They did a lot of targeted plotting and planning, not just against the Trump organization, but also against lots of US officials. That was meant to rile up and essentially create chaos in the US. And none of this worked, but it was particularly aggressive. Their reach and resources are very limited. So limited are their resources that they actually copy and paste Russia Today articles or Russian propaganda because they can't get it all done themselves. There are opportunities that really in Europe and in terms of copy and coordination, using everyone else's materials to advance theirs. But at the moment, Iran is almost in an internal information war with itself. So it's not really a strategic priority, I don't think, in the information fight. They have a lot of internal conflict going on at the moment. Separately is the one that we really need to worry about moving forward. Yes, Russia is still going to be there. They're stoking all sorts of chaos here in the United States, around the world. But what's interesting is really how science is starting to overtake. Science is starting to overtake the art, meaning what China has done just in the last 2 to 3 years in terms of scaling their information fight, particularly as COVID-19 came around, advancing accounts around the world, increasing the output of those accounts, and moving to different languages. Language is the big weakness for the Chinese. They are not effective communicators in English the way the Russians are in particular, but that might change over time. And they're focused very heavily on the Chinese diaspora. They don't have that much interest in really messing with US audiences, but they have a lot of interest and establishing control in their sphere of influence, which is particularly around the Pacific Rim. Their one weakness is the social control, meaning as of now, they still have social control, but that could change over time. Over time, they might find themselves really facing off against an internal population that won't accept social control in that sort of way. And that's a weakness or a way that we can probably think about dealing with China in the information fight. I see a question from Bill. Don't you think that the control of the information space, or is already disinformation, is being waged at the national level on a geographic basis by certain actors with the objective being international disunity or disunity among each of our allies in the treatment of them and our nation, such as Arab-Israeli flare-ups here? Yeah, I think it really comes down to, and this is kind of a larger issue that I'll be working on at FPRI in a couple upcoming articles, which is the breakup of the internet. There's only really 3 internets at this point, not just one. And the 3 internets are China's internet, which is highly controlled, but also goes out to the largest number of people, probably around the world in terms of its control. The separate second one is the free internet that we see in the West, or what we think we see in the West, which is shaped a lot by ownership structures, applications, and the way different countries share information. And then the third one is what I called authoritarian distorted internets. So it would be Russia, Syria, for example, or other authoritarian regimes, even in Southeast Asia, where they distort it based on their censorship. And when they do that, they're creating alternative pictures that are different and conflicting, and also hard for populations to understand overall. And so, yes, there is a degree of that. The US just suffers to a degree because they don't have that sort of control, but it's also an essential feature of our democracy. And that's one that really will come to play here in a second, and I'll address that, Bill. Is a great question. So in terms of influence, the other part that I was trying to talk about in terms of how countries vis-a-vis the United States perform and what they do and how they think about things is really the methods of influence. And they have a mixture of physical and virtual world. So this is a very small slide, and this is also several-month-old assessment. I probably would update it a little bit, but there's a wide range of influence activities that are more or less complex. And so when we look at the countries that are out there, Russia plays a strong hand in all of these influence activities because they know they can't play a strong hand in other activities, meaning that they're limited. They can only achieve so much in certain spaces, like militarily or economically. But in the influence space, for a very low cost, they can be pretty successful. Separately, Iran is actually very aggressive in many respects, trying to do things that are a little bit more complicated, but highly limited. And China, I would probably change some of that assessment that you see there at the bottom right now in terms of what they're undertaking vis-a-vis other countries. We tend to be very US-centric, and the election distorted our perception of what China's trying to do. Across the Pacific Rim and everywhere they're putting their Belt and Road news network in the information space, you're seeing a massive uptick in influence activities, both on the ground and online. And they will be the most formidable adversary that we see in the information space over time in the coming months and years. And so when looking at this perspective, I like to emphasize most of the studies that you'll see or articles that you'll see out in the open space will talk about Twitter or tweets. That's one of my least concerns in terms of influence. It's a combination of information and money. It's a combination of information and power pushed and controlled by certain media outlets around the world, some which are private sector, some which are owned by the nation states, and some which are a mix of the two. So China's doing a very interesting media buy or series of buys around the world that will really shape how people come to understand Chinese influence. And it's quite a bit different from Russia, which at best will try and establish its own fringe news outlets, but really doesn't have the resources or the technology to advance in the same sort of way that we're seeing China do today. So just a quick snapshot as well is America's adversaries have a lot to say, and they know what they want to say. And they do that in an enduring way. The US just doesn't do it. They're just not doing it the same way. We have some successes. Radio Free Europe has been particularly successful. Russia's concerned about it right now. They're trying to push kind of some legislation in terms of foreign agent type registration against Radio Free Europe. So that's a good sign that we do have the capability to do it. I think the problem is the way we go about it. We are still in a very analog setup, meaning we're focused very heavily on news, and we're focused very heavily on print and old traditional style of like TV broadcasting. That's not how our adversaries are advancing messages around the world. Things have really changed in terms of the way messages get out. And the messenger is as important as the message is, meaning in the social media space, people tend to gravitate towards and link to different messengers. And by that, I mean, in the social media space, it's video and it's audio increasingly. It is not text print the way that we essentially built out our foundation. Our foundation came from newspapers with radio broadcast, with video news, television broadcast. That's not how most people receive their information. I like to think about it like if in terms of transition, if this were 1991, 30 years ago, most people read a local newspaper, they listened to local radio, maybe just a little bit of it in terms of news, and they watched maybe 30 minutes of national news per night. They might have watched 30 additional minutes of local news every evening, or vice versa. They probably watch more local news than even national news. Fast forward to today, not only is the topic more national in terms of discussion, but the consumption time is enormously higher. People spend hours a day on social media, and they're receiving news in all sorts of forms, but increasingly in terms of video and audio content. When we were running 2020 election analysis, of every monitoring list that I built, the number one link out from 2020 was YouTube. So they were linking to YouTube content when they were doing their foreign influence activities against the US, and that would be the same of domestic political campaigns. In 2016, it was blogs and websites. So that's a 4-year change where you can see just the uptake of video, the speed at which people can make video. That's been incredible. The other thing that I disagree with when I listen to discussions about information warfare is the excessive focus on disinformation. And maybe that's partly, my fault. I was part of the 4 and 5 years ago, part of the sort of raising awareness here at FPRI around disinformation. And it is important. But for the most part, propaganda is the backbone of what I see in terms of what foreign adversaries are doing. It's selection bias. It's not outright falsehoods. And in terms of that, they still have to put out about 70% news. No one can influence by lying 100% of the time. People know that. And so you have to win the audience's trust, and you have to play to their preferences in social media. To do that, you have to do that by actually broadcasting news. And the news has to be truthful to a degree, or people will tune it out. You can't scale an audience indefinitely through straight falsehoods. So if you want to layer disinformation strategically, which can be very damaging to a country or a person or an institution, you still have to create a backbone of news and straight propaganda in order to do that. And I think it's, I think it's going to be extremely important to understand that, moving forward as well. So what are our adversaries doing? Our adversaries are doing a combination of different things, but there's only a couple of them that can insource. And this is where things will get very strange in the warfare, in the warfare environment, information warfare environment. Some are insourcing. And so those are state-sponsored news outlets, fringe media sites, which you probably saw many of them were sanctioned by the Biden administration in the last month. Social media personas being put out, both true and false. Russia does a brilliant job of using social media personas of Westerners that work for them inside the West. And China is trying to do that to a limited degree, but not having as much success. And they build out production companies. Russia's greatest success in the last 2 years has really been through social media production at an outlet called Redfish, which they sponsor in Berlin, Germany. They pay for it. Staffed by a lot of Russians or Germans of Russian descent, which are producing exclusive content targeting the political left in the United States on Instagram, other videos, feeds that are short. So that's prolific, and that's sort of the insourcing model. But really, beyond Russia and China, no one really has the backbone to do this, nor the desire to fund that over time. That is an enormous cost. It's still cheaper than outright warfare, but it is an enormous cost for many of these regimes. And so when I talk to officials in the US government, they, are not thinking about really doing this, that if you want to stay in an information space over time, you need to be broadcasting in languages and on platforms overseas in an enduring way. You can tell what Russia and China are seeking to achieve because they forecast it by building out state-sponsored outlets and then having fringe sites and then coming in with production companies. They're doing it in a very deliberate and overt way. This isn't that much covert. Separately, there's outsourcing going on, and this is pretty much all of the countries in the world right now. In particular, Russia and China, part of the reason they create either troll farms or content farms is they need someone to make enough content to keep this broadcast going. It's pretty tough to do daily broadcasting of information that suits one's needs, and so they go to lower cost places. Russia tried to set some up in Africa this last time, both in English and French and Arabic, and a little bit of Arabic content. China is setting up in the Chinese diaspora in Malaysia and Indonesia. Even in Taiwan, they were able to do that a little bit. The other part is just creating alliances. If your partners in English language, for example, I'm going to show you a snapshot of this, are producing a lot of content in English, why not just use it? It's free content that can be regenerated. And the last part is Americans have been attacking each other so much over the last 5 to 6 years on social media that there's an unending and openly available set of user-generated content from the United States, which all of America's adversaries can use and repurpose and send back to the United States. It's kind of remarkable how this has played out over the last couple of years. So just to give you a quick snapshot, this is a sample I took today. I update this from time to time, but you can just see in terms of the volume, just every single time I go back, this is the Hamilton dashboard at the Alliance for Securing Democracy. The number of accounts goes up. The number of followers goes up. That's just of the accounts of Russia, Iran, China combined. Most of those are Russia and China. 624 accounts, they're hitting almost 100 million followers. And this is in the English language. This is English language broadcasting. I should say, English and associated RT channels, plus all of their contributors. So there is some Russian and a few French languages, but it's predominantly in English. They're having an outsized impact in this space currently. And if they're having that many tweets, think how many broadcasts and other things that they're sharing as well. Which leads me to really, you can look at where they're having success on a daily basis across the board. Russia and Spanish, Russia and Arabic, Russia and Turkish. These languages, they are dominating the information space. They are essentially the news broadcaster in many of these regions. RT and Espanol and their disinformation around COVID vaccines in the United States has creeped in and harmed US vaccine uptake amongst Spanish-speaking communities inside the United States. That's how powerful their messaging is in that region. In terms of China, what you'll see that's a little bit different is how they use and exploit their diplomats. So they will do a very synchronized way of using their diplomats, foreign ministers to do broadcasting in a unified way, and they will amplify each other in a very unified way. So it's almost as if they have a retweeting or rebroadcasting sort of network that is highly coordinated that they can use at any time. So I don't want to go on too long, but I wanted to talk about a few things that Americans haven't quite adjusted to, which our adversaries do understand, which is there are several things, and I talked about this when I wrote my book, but there's several things that should help us sort of program and think about what we want to do in terms of the information space. The first is there are 3 biases that drive us to believe things that aren't true or to fall for propaganda in the information space, particularly in social media. The first is that it's a confirmation bias machine. When you go to social media, every time you read something, like it or share it, you are creating an algorithmic effect, which will lead to you being delivered more of what you like, read, and share. That generally can be good. Let's say you want news about your local area, and so you click on it, it's about Philadelphia, let's say, and you get more news about Philadelphia. But as political partisanship, social issues come up, people tend to drill down on and keep going and confirming their position, which then blocks out alternative explanations or information, which can lead to the second part, which is what you tend to trust. Implicit bias. Long ago, let's go back 30 years again to 1991, the source of the information was the person that produced it or the outlet that produced it. Today, the source of the information when we see it on social media is the person that shared it with us. That's implicit bias. And we tend to like information that comes from our in-group. Facebook is the biggest in-group machine there's ever been. It is your friends, it's your followers, it's people that are in your family, it's people that you work with that think like you. They're involved in your personal life and discussions. They know you well. And it oftentimes turns out that you look like, talk like, and think like the people in that friend circle. And you share the same information over and over again. That creates the last one, which is availability. Those who speak the most are most likely to be seen. And so on any given issue, if you keep seeing the same piece of information or news, you will tend to think that it's probably correct, when it really could just be the algorithm and your friends and followers just keep delivering it to you over and over, which creates this distortion effect. That distortion effect is very well understood by the Kremlin, meaning they understand what you like, they understand who you want to hear it from, and they create news to fill those voids where there isn't the news that they want to have happen by making overt news, propaganda, and disinformation to match your feeds, your preferences coming from people that look like you and talk like you. For example, I like to remind people on election night 2016, there were 3 hosts for election coverage on RT in the US. Who were the messengers? It was Larry King, formerly CNN. It was Ed Schultz, who used to be at MSNBC, and it was Jesse Ventura, who has outstanding presence with conspiracy theorists. So they're using the implicit bias of different messengers and different audiences around the same event, and they're creating a large amount of content. Separately, they understand in terms of manipulation, and this isn't unique to the Russians. Anybody that's very successful in advertising and in terms of influence in general, social media influence in general, understands what you tend to believe. And so if you combine your biases with what you tend to believe, you can create a system which essentially helps you deliver and actually change the way information warfare is fought. So first, people tend to believe what they see first. You have to, because you have to consider it, even if it's false. In order to debunk it, you have to consider the position that it might be true. Once it's in your mind, it's very hard to shake that or move that out. Second, you tend to believe that which you see most. And we know that from advertising. That's why we see the same thing over and over and over again. The more you see something, the more you tend to assume that it must be true or people wouldn't continue to say it. The third thing is trusted source, and that's where that implicit bias comes in. If you trust the source of the information, which may now be the person that delivers it to you, not necessarily the institution, you will tend to take that on. And last, if there's no rebuttal or no alternative explanation, then you will tend to believe it as well. This, by the way, is the secret sauce of the Chinese system, meaning they don't allow rebuttals and they don't allow alternative information. So even if you wanted to influence in the Chinese space, you would have to insert and scale a rebuttal from a trusted source and do it quickly. That is an almost impossible challenge for us in the West if we wanted to communicate, let's say, around COVID-19 or vaccines or any issue vis-a-vis the Chinese. So this system of manipulation becomes very easy for adversaries, but also gives us a way to think about what we might do in terms of fighting the information space. So kind of bringing all this together is the way the US government has structured itself for messaging. If we were doing health and science, I'm using Dr. Fauci here as an example because he was a messenger in the 1990s. And so in the traditional way, there would be a traditional messenger. They would go to a podium, they would deliver a talk, much like we see now, but it would only be mediated by the mainstream media, which was usually just a few newspaper reporters, Associated Press and Reuters, New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, and a few television broadcast channels, usually 3, maybe 4 when CNN was coming online as a cable channel. But that would be communicated out to a mass audience. Over the last year, it is apparent that has completely gone away. Any message that goes out is very quickly, rebutted or pushed against in ways that are not entirely apparent. So, I worked with the team. We were looking at the pandemic last year while we were talking about the election. The two issues really converged, that and George Floyd protests. Many different ideologies were moving very quickly. Many people were trying to make money off fake cures or inciting fear. And so all of those messengers in the social media space have a singular target, which is, in this case, it was Dr. Fauci, but you could pick it on any institutional leader. Chris Krebs is another example from the election. He became the singular target for hundreds, thousands, even tens of thousands of messengers who are targeting him on social media and continue to today. Many doctors are in this sort of space right now. And so for institutional leaders, there's splintered understanding because they're still trying to message in a very traditional way and be the single point of information. But if I told you to charge into a machine gun nest, you would not make it, right? And that's kind of what's happening in the information environment. We're sending out singular messengers, pushing them into the information space, and then pushing them out there over and over and over again to talk to audiences that don't look like them and don't think like them and don't talk like them. So in terms of restoring collective understanding, we have to understand how adversaries in the information space, particularly Russia, China, or even in terms of those that just want to destroy democracy writ large, is that you have to restore collective understanding through a network of messengers who are trusted and look like and talk like the audiences they're trying to connect with. And that networked approach, very, very similar to how lots of successful campaigns have looked over time, but we need to make it not about US domestic politics. We essentially have to change the frame that we're building a network of trusted messengers for the common good. And there's lots of issues we could do that on, cybersecurity being one of them. Across the world and in the United States, there are many entities interested in a secure and safe internet. Same in terms of our battle with China. We have to create some sort of unity around it. Right now, two of the most prolific people undermining that are actually being levied by the Chinese government, but they're inside the United States. So we have to think about how we would navigate that. And it really comes to how do you build a trusted network of messengers that can reinforce a sense of truth. And I think the big goal for 2022 and beyond is how do we scale truth and institutional confidence in democracy without wading into nonstop domestic politics discussions that affect us both at home, but particularly abroad. Right now, whenever our adversaries want to challenge us, if it's China, Iran, or Russia, when we did our FIE project, they were using domestic political lines of attack against our own domestic politics and essentially using it to break us apart. That's a situation we can't sustain. We have to come together with it. And so I think that kind of brings me to my last thing, which is, if we're going to participate in an information war, which we are not right now, we are just losing. We're taking 100% loss in the information space. We have to determine what that campaign, what's its objectives, what are we trying to achieve? Next, we have to say something and start saying something very quickly. What do we want to advance to the world? It's not entirely clear what we want to say around the world right now. So that's an enormous challenge for us. Third, we have to establish some deterrence. And I think you're starting to see that for the very first time, both in terms of cybersecurity and cyberspace. There's been a major change, I think, in the last few months. In the information space, I think you're starting to see that evolve very slowly, but I think it will build throughout the year, which is what does that deterrence look like? And I think the sanctions against Russia for election interference, some of the sanctions against Iran that have already come out, I imagine there'll be more in both of those cases, and I expect with China as well. That hopefully will begin to establish a system of deterrence that our allies can also partner with us on in each issue. In line with that last slide, we have to have an exponential increase in the number of messengers. We cannot rely on one person in Washington, D.C. behind a podium to push messaging out, to try and push facts out, to try and push institutions out, it's just not going to work at all. It won't work. It's not how the digital space works. And I think that goes to my last point, which is we've got a message for the digital era. I had a typo autocorrect in there. Digital era, not the analog era, meaning we need to start pushing out communications in a way that matches the way our adversaries are attacking us. They are in our audience space. And that goes back to my my very first slide, which is about audience space. They are in our audience space. We are not in theirs. We are 100% on defense. They're 100% on offense. So we have to change this paradigm. And part of that is just recognizing the way the digital era has overtaken the analog era. Yeah, we'll always do traditional messaging at podiums. We'll always want to put out fact-based messages. We'll always engage in that, but that is a fraction of the information environment, not all of it the way it was possibly in 1991. So with that, I'm going to take a couple questions here. Let me stop share. All right. Actually, I'll just go back to hopefully I got that right. We can kind of go from there. So I got a couple questions here, and Eli, Raleigh, if you see any others. So from Jerry, Jerry says, how is Chinese technology advancing their effectiveness around the world, such as advances in 5G, GPS type technology, robotics, AI? Yeah, their communication ability is remarkable. They're moving very, very quickly. Their use of artificial intelligence will do several things. So in terms of audience spaces, I think what's important to think about is they'll be able to control their audience and detect anytime there's dissension. They'll be able to stop individuals or people that are maneuvering around them in ways that are very, very tough to create any sort of a retaliatory response by the United States. I think separately, in terms of 5G, their ability to move to a digital currency. You know, I was always told long ago, and Bob Murray, who is a fellow here with FPRI, was always told long ago the US dollar would never be replaced. I don't know that that's the case anymore over time. It's a decade, or so away, but that's our last thing we have as a country, I think, that we can still dominate in is the economic markets. So we need to be very cautious of that. They're moving in such a way that they can learn from transactions in the digital yuan and some of the digital currency spaces. And as they expand out that infrastructure from China, particularly in their near abroad, that could be just incredibly damaging to the US in terms of our world standing and the whole idea of advancing democracy as a whole. Their technology is advancing. One thing that I'm not confident about, though, is that they'll be able to hold it together at home in terms of their current structure. I'm not a China specialist, but as they continue to grow, I think there will be some dangers internally for China that are also unanticipated. They probably are aware of it, but the idea that you can keep 1.3 to 1.5 billion people together and move it forward in the digital age without issue, probably not realistic, I don't think. Someone asks, are these tools, tactics, and procedures being used currently in the domestic social political sphere? See many synergies from left and right activists. Yeah, so left and right activists do this. I think the issue is, hold on a second. I think the issue is resources and sustainability. In terms of danger, usually what happens is social activists cannot sustain these campaigns in the way a nation state can. They don't have the commitment to objectives in the same way. It's hard to keep populations doing things for free. It's hard to create the intricacies and the technology to do these things in an enduring way. In the political space, it's definitely there. And so when you see an alignment between conspiracies, cable news outworks, social media spaces, the way we saw with the QAnon phenomenon last year, then it becomes particularly dangerous. But it's not necessarily dangerous to any specific set of people. It's more dangerous to society as a whole, because it creates an alternative reality environment that doesn't make any sense, really. So that is some of the danger, but I do feel like it's episodic. The only long-term impact I see from this is just that trust and confidence in the U.S. as a stable broker for the world in terms of democracy. I think that's the big fear. What are your thoughts on Facebook Oversight Board as an arbiter of information? Is this a way we establish trusted network of information messengers? I think to a degree, look, Facebook Oversight Board only exists because our Congress can't make rules. If they were able to make rules, there wouldn't be a Facebook Oversight Board. I think for the social media companies, if they're told what the rules are, they'll enforce them. Otherwise, they'll play to whoever has the majority in Congress. And so it's interesting. I don't want to wade into domestic politics too much, but Donald Trump was deplatformed from a lot of social media platforms after January 6th. Many took that as because of the actions of January 6th. I took it that 2 senators from the Democratic Party won Senate seats that week. I don't actually see it as effect of his content necessarily, or they could have done that at any time over the previous 3 to 4 years. So ultimately, what I find interesting about the Facebook Oversight Board is it is a process. It's transparent. You know who the judges are. I'd like the collective way that's done. It would be better if it was in the nonprofit space. I actually argued for something like this, but kind of sitting independent of social media and the U.S. government. I thought their judgment was correct. It was both, yes, this person should be deplatformed, but you need to establish set rules and patterns around behavior and what the timeline is for these sorts of things. So they kind of agreed and disagreed with Facebook on it. I thought that was good. So at least it's a way to arbitrate to some degree. If Congress wants to do something different, I bet Facebook will do it, because they ultimately just want consistency around regulation so they can figure out where to navigate. Lawrence, U.S. government is bad, highly polarized domestic political climate. What can we develop? I think there are several messages and areas that we could focus on separate from Republican, Democrat in the United States that would be very helpful for what's going on right now. Cybersecurity is one, public health is another, and we can also pick areas where we all used to come together, like the Olympics. So I do think there are ways we can focus it if we can get it out of the DC political gridlock, and maybe they will. The new administration's been highly focused, first on the pandemic. Now you can see it on Russia, China, Israel, Palestine kind of hit them probably out of left field, and they're trying to manage that as a distracting foreign policy event that they didn't know was on the horizon. So there are some opportunities for them if they can get a focus. And I think they're still finishing out their kind of sensing of the landscape based on my conversations with some of them. Many of them have only been in the job a month or less. So they need a little more time probably to get their head around what they want to do. The bottom question, what U.S. departments or agencies are in charge of countering political cyber warfare? So Cyber Command has the mandate of defending and taking action. And it seems like they're doing it. In the domestic space, and this is where it gets weird, I think if you saw the reporting around SolarWinds and the hack of Russia into our systems with SolarWinds, what was interesting is that once it enters the U.S. supply chain or comes inside the United States, Cyber Command does not have a mandate to probe, investigate, or send anyone into those networks. So this is a kind of a break where they defend up to a point, but once it becomes domestic, they're out. And so you're seeing some arguing that they need to have a bigger role in the domestic space if they're going to defend against these things. DHS CISA, which is Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, I think is what it stands for. But they have a role in that, but this is a very small staffed entity. It's mostly for coordination between public-private sector, and their mandate is enormous. I think what you'll see over time is that they will expand in terms of their mandate, and DHS will as well, but they can't cover everything in the U.S. Domestic space, and they're weaker. They're weaker across the board in comparison to the private sector. So we'll see how that plays out. I think there will be expansion continuously over the next 4 years at least of cybersecurity coordination in the United States government and partnership between public and private, which is long overdue and should have happened 4 years before that. And there were some really talented people in the last administration, but they didn't get to stay very long, or they were moved around quite a bit. So I'm hoping there'll be some consistency, over the next 4 years. What's on my whiteboard? I will actually show you, which is, that is the first version of this slide that is behind me right now when I was drawing it up, trying to figure out how to present that slide right there. So that's what that one is. Next question, is electronic censorship viable to regain public trust in a democracy? No. So I think this is my biggest complaint with most of the proposals that I see about how to fight information warfare. A lot of it focuses on policing content and trying to tell people what not to say. It's not very American. That once we get to, yes, do we need to, think about policing content? For sure. We've always had this rule with our free speech, which is you can't yell fire in a movie theater when there isn't one, right? We've always talked about these things. We just need to figure out what the application of that is in the online environment, which is incitement. If you're inciting people to violence, then that's not protected free speech. We know that from the Constitution. And I could give you 100 examples a day of direct incitement to violence and attacking people. We see it all the time. Yeah, okay, that is something that needs to be policed and deplatformed and metered, and we should give people boundaries around it and tell them what the penalties are for doing as such. Separately, though, I don't think that electronic censorship is the way to go. First, it doesn't work. Second, it creates, insurgencies subsurface that will ultimately render themselves in another way that will work around the system. And third, the beauty of American democracy and all democracies is a plethora of views, and we grow stronger by the aggregation of all of those views and ideas as we move forward. So yeah, those autocratic countries that are doing it, like China, good luck. I mean, we'll see how 1984, the book goes for a whole country over time. How motivated are you going to be when you're digitally suppressed for every aspect of your life? What we don't hear is there is some dissension in the rank in China in lots of different ways. And if media ownership and acquisition can't be sustained, that will fall apart too. And in the case of China, there's enormous amounts of corruption in this controlled setting. And imagine being an artificial intelligence developer and you find out that everything is corrupt and that you can't sustain ownership in your business. You're maybe not going to be as innovative and creative, over time. I'm looking here. I don't see any other questions. Raleigh and wait. Make sure I didn't miss any here. I think I got them all. Yeah, I think my last note would be look for major changes. Oh, I got one more about AI, which I'll come to, Scott. Look for not major. I think major changes in approach and small incremental modifications in application over the year. You're starting to see people with ideas about what they want to achieve. They'll start to roll those out. Yeah, I try and remind myself that it's only May, and it does seem like a long time ago since inauguration, even longer, 6 months ago since the election now, but you're starting to see some specifics. I do like the stability to a degree in the foreign policy space. And I hope that kind of can sustain itself. You're seeing more measured sort of application. I'm hoping by fall, there's a clear direction on what America wants to achieve in a lot of this. And I also think this is a great time to reset foreign policy based on those things that are most important to us. For example, our two most important foreign partners are Canada and Mexico. And we don't hear enough about that. We hear a lot about places on the other side of the planet. But with climate change, for example, it's going to be things that happen in North America that are going to be catastrophic, life-changing in terms of movement, migration of people. Those are the things maybe we need to focus on a little bit more closer at home. While we've been out and afar since the war on terror. The last question I think here is, how will AI machine learning impact messaging? Can it restore collective understanding by identifying propaganda? It's already kind of happening to a degree. I think the important point is that AI cannot detect or anticipate things it's not seen before. The learning model is based on knowns. It has not gotten to a point where it can anticipate the unknown. So you'll see this with every manipulator that's out there. Once they get deplatformed, censored, controlled, once their messages get spotted, they just innovate a little bit more and they change it, which means the AI models need to catch up again. And so it gets better. It can improve the information environment. It can help in the collective understanding, but ultimately it's not going to solve it. And I think the way to think about it is you have to actually increase the messaging of truth. The truth has one voice, lies have an infinite number of voices. And so we've not done enough of trying to advance and scale the truth out to enough messengers. We're too dependent on one or two people to try and fight the entire information environment for them. We need to help them out. Any other questions? Well, thanks everybody for joining today. I have an article that will be essentially coming up at FPRI. I was working on it through the weekend, and we should have it up here pretty quick, and I'll make sure and post it. And Raleigh and to the team, thanks for setting this up today.
Clint, thanks so much. It's always fascinating, intriguing. I always learn something new, and certainly looking at this from a different perspective, and appreciate you taking the time today. I look forward to reading your article as well. And to our audience, thank you again for joining us today. This is being recorded, and we usually get it posted. We always say within 24 hours, but it's usually much more quick. It's much more quick than that. So it'll be on the FPRI YouTube page. Check us out, www.fpri.org. If you're not a member or subscriber, please consider becoming one. And Clint, thank you again. That was really fantastic. Take care all. Bye.